So, second purpose we can say to introduce much more competition into the economy, to introduce in competition in the economy, and in students that uh, with the perfect competition, the quality of goods improve. So, government introduced liberalization to introduce much more competition into the economy and creating incentive for increasing efficiency of operation, so government introduced because government wanted to be more competition in the economy, and that with liberalization policy, that will enhance efficiency of operations. That was the purpose for introducing liberalization in India in 1991. The economic reforms taken by the government under liberalization in every sector, like industrial sector, financial sector, tax reforms, foreign exchange reforms, trade and investment policy reforms. So we can say that the economic reforms taken by the government taken by the government taken by the government under liberalization. The first reforms were industrial sector reforms. Then second one is financial sector reforms. Third one is tax reforms, uh, related to tax policy. There was also reforms introduced by the government. And foreign exchange reforms, and last one, that is trade and investment policy reforms. So in every sector, the reforms were started by the government. These are the industrial sector reforms, financial sector reforms, tax reforms, foreign exchange reforms, trade and investment policy reforms. So in these reforms, I will discuss one by one. In industrial sector reforms, what kind of policy is started by the government, or what kind of reforms were started by the government. I will discuss one by one: industrial sector, financial sector, tax reform, foreign exchange reforms, and trade and investment policy reforms. Students, now I will discuss the industrial sector reforms. What kind of reforms taken by the government in industrial sector in 1991? In order to make necessary reforms in the industrial sector, the government of India introduced new industrial policy. Introduced by the government in July 24, 1991. July 24, 1991, government introduced new industrial policy for the industrial sector reforms. In the various measures under industrial policy reforms taken, the first one is reduction in industrial licensing. Reduction in industrial licensing. First reforms under industrial sector reforms is reduction in industrial licensing. The new policy abolished industrial licensing for all the projects except for short list of industries. Few industries still needed licensing, like these industries, like list I am writing in the list of industry which still needed license from the government. License is the kind of permission, like liquor, liquor, uh, defense, arms and defense equipments, industrial explosive, etc. Means these industries still needed license, like liquor, defense equipments, industrial explosive, etc. Means these things are related to the uh, defense equipment are related to the safety and security of the country. Industrial explosive is also related to the safety and security. Liquor is of course related to social safety and security. So these industries still needed a licensing before, except these industry, government abolished industrial licensing, for all the projects. No license were needed to set up new units or expand or diversify the existing line of manufacture. However, license is required for certain industries related to security and strategic consideration. So, in the first reforms, that is reduction in industrial licensing, government abolished industrial licensing for all the projects except few industries which still needed licensing, like these industry like liquor, defense equipment, industrial and industrial explosion. No license were needed to set up new units or expand or diversify the existing lines of manufacture. As you know, students, before 1991, for setting up new units or expanding or diversifying the existing line of manufacture, the private sector or industrialist needed to take permission from the government. But in this reforms, that is industrial sector reforms started by the government in 24th July 1991, the first thing government did is abolished this policy, that is industrial licensing policy for all the projects except few that I discussed, and no license were needed to set up new industry or expand or diversify the existing line of manufacture. However, in certain industries where license is still required, which are related to security and strategic consideration. Now, second reforms, that is decrease in role of public sector. Decrease in role of public sector. Public sector are those sector which are managed and controlled by the government. The second reforms by the government, that is decrease the role of public sector. One of the striking features was the substantive reduction in role of the public sector in the future industrial development of the country. The number of industries exclusively reserved for public sector before 1991 was 17. Before 1991, it was 17 public sector which are exclusively reserved for the public sector. But that after 1991, it reduced to 3 industries which are still under the control of the government or managed and controlled by the government. Means after 1991, only 3 public sector industries, public sector, 3 public sector industries were under the control of the government. Only 3. These industries are still in the control of government are defense equipment, atomic energy generation, and railway transport. These 3 industries left for means these industries still managed and controlled by the government. Earlier, before 1991, 17 in public sector industries were under the control of the government. So students, this is the second reforms that is introduced by the government. Decrease in the role of public sector. Earlier, before 1991, most of the sector is controlled by the government or public sector. Exclusively 17 main industries were public sector enterprises, and their number reduced to 3 in 1991. These three industries were still in the control of the government. These are defense equipment, atomic energy generation, and railway transport. Third reforms started by the government, that is de-reservation under small scale industries. De-reservation under small scale industry. Many goods produced by small scale industries have now been de-reserved. The investment ceiling on the plant and machinery for small undertakings enhanced to rupees 1 crore. 5 crores. Right now it is 5 crore. Means if anybody wanted to set up a small scale industry, or those industries were considered small scale industries which where the investment required is 5 crores. Maximum 5 crores investment required in a small scale industry. In many industries, the market was allowed to determine the price through forces of the market, like not by the forces of the market, means not by the directive policy of the government. Before 1991, the government measure price. What would be the price of the any goods that where there were lots of interference by the government, but after this reforms in 1991, now the price of the goods, whether it is manufactured in small scale or large scale, medium scale, the price is now determined by the forces of market, means forces according to demand and supply of the goods. Next reform started by the government, that is monopolies and restrictive trade practices. That is small form, we can say it MRTP Act. Monopolies and Restrictive Trade Practices Act, that is very much known as MRTP Act. With the introduction of liberalization expansion scheme, the requirement for large company to seek prior approval for expansion, establishment of new undertaking, merger and amalgamation, etc. were eliminated. Means controlling the government started this policy actually for the so any industry cannot work as a monopoly. Monopolies is always not good for the economy. So government started this act. Under this act, the expansion scheme and requirement for large company to seek prior approval for expansion, establishment of new undertakings, mergers, amalgamation, etc. were eliminated. So these are the major reforms policy started by the government, which are for industrial sector. For industrial sector reforms, first one is reduction in industrial licensing, second is decrease in role of public sector, third is de-reservation under small scale industries, and fourth one is monopolies and restrictive trade practices. To discourage monopolies in economy, government started this policy, that is monopolies and restrictive trade practices, that is very much known as MRTP Act. These are the reforms related to industrial sector. In my next video, I will discuss financial sector reforms. For financial sector, what kind of reforms introduced by the government in 1991? Thank you. Good morning, students. In my previous video, I started a new chapter, that is new economic policy, and new economic policy government started or initiated varieties of policy which were liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Today I am going to discuss about the first policy, that is liberalization. What is liberalization? Liberalization means removal of, in broader prospect, liberalization means removal of entry and growth restrictions on the private sector. Again I am repeating, in liberalization means removal of entry and growth restrictions on the private sector. Students, as I discussed in my few videos, that prior to 1991 there were a large number of government restrictions in India in the areas of licensing, import, export, trade, dealing in foreign exchange, etc. In July 1991, you must remember the date, in July 1991, a package of economic reforms were announced, which marked the beginning of the process of liberalization in India. Again, what is liberalization? In liberalization, government remove government remove all the restrictions which was prior to 1991 on private sector. By phase wise, government remove all the restrictions like licensing, quotas, export process related to export and import. So in the liberalization process, government reduce or removed all those restrictions in phase wise in 1991 economic reforms. Again, liberalization means removal of entry and growth restrictions on the private sector. Before 1991, the private sector had to take permission for establishing new industries or expansion of their industries, and for the diversification of output. But after 1991, government removed all those restrictions or all those policies which was hampering the growth of private sector. Government removed all those restrictions. So liberalization means removal of entry and growth restrictions which was before 1991 on the private sector. Now question is, why the need of liberalization, or what was the purpose of liberalization? So the purpose was to unlock the economic potential of the country by encouraging private sector and multinational corporations to invest and expand. The first purpose for introducing liberalization was to unlock the economic potential of the country by encouraging private sector and multinational corporation to invest and expand. That was the main purpose, first purpose we can say, for the introducing liberalization in our country in 1991. Second purpose was to introduce much more competition, to introduce much more competition into the economy, into the economy, and creating incentives for increasing efficiency efficiency of operations.